Thank you so much for joining us here today for our panel discussion, Community Engagement as a Mindset. My name is Ty Pierce. I'm a product manager with OCLC, but today I'm lucky in that I get to share the microphone with three incredible library leaders who are here to talk about this topic, have a deep knowledge of this topic. And so I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves very briefly, and we're gonna get started because we have, as we found out last night when we met briefly, a lot to talk about, and we're going to use every bit of the time that we have with you this morning. So you want to start down at the end with Pam?
Sure. So I'm Pam Sandlian Smith with Anythink, and yesterday I was introduced as Pam from Anythink, so that's my new moniker.
There you go. I'm Mary Lou Carolan. I am currently with the Newburgh Free Library, an inner city library in the Hudson Valley area of New York.
And I'm Cordelia Anderson. I have worked for 15 years in libraries at Charlotte Mecklenburg Library. And then last fall, I left and started a consulting firm, and I've been working with public and academic libraries ever since.
And so thank you again for joining us today. Community engagement it seems like it's always a hot topic in libraries, and it's certainly more important now, I think, than ever. But it's a term that means something different to everyone. Everyone, I think, has kind of a different mental picture when they hear it. Maybe that picture is a little fuzzy. Maybe it's based on their soul experience in their library. But for every library, they're kind of approaching it differently. And that's appropriate, right? You know, you have individual needs, your community has individual needs. But that term and what it means in the practice is really still being defined. And I think that's why we're so excited today, is because these three have an incredible wealth of experience in defining that and have very strong takes on what that means. And so just to kind of kick things off, we gave a little bit of homework using the idea of community engagement as a mindset. And we asked each of the panelists to describe what that means to them in a single sentence. So not a daunting task by any means. And so their responses, I'll read those real quick just to kind of get us started. For Pam, she said, community engagement refocuses the role of public libraries from the collection to connecting people with ideas, information, and experiences. For Mary Lou, community engagement as a mindset means that every conversation, every decision starts with the needs and priorities of the communities you serve, with all decisions and actions flowing from that perspective. And for Cordelia, community engagement as a mindset means we must immerse ourselves in the decision-making process of our communities to take a seat at the table, not wait to be asked, and get to know our communities intimately. And so I think that was an incredible encapsulation of it, but to kind of kick it off, are there other things we want to talk about? You know, I noticed some commonalities, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit more from you all past that single sentence definition of community engagement as a mindset.
I think at its heart, for all three of those statements, it's about starting from the outside in and not starting from the inside out.
Absolutely. There was a term that was used quite a bit when I first started in library world, and I believe it still is, where we say that the library is the heart of the community. And I think we really need to shift that, because I think that's gotten us to be more distant from the community, thinking that people need to come into the library in order to experience us. And so if you take that shift, many of you may have heard this, but the community is the heart of the library. Mm-hmm. It takes the discussion and the feeling in a whole different way, and it encourages us to make sure that the community really is in our heart and not the other way around. That's how we remain vital and engaged and communicating, interacting with the folks that we serve.
I actually really love that.
Me too. I'm writing it down.
Because I think that that addresses, I think at public libraries especially, we are evolving from that place where our focus is really about the collection. Mm-hmm. And being much more analytical and organized, and all of those things are critical for the way we do our work. But I think the most important piece of our work is really actually the heart part of our work, which is how do we support people? How do we capture our energy to help support people's hopes and dreams and to help them succeed? So that it really, our balance is really shifting to, it's all about the people, whether they're in the library or in the community.
I think that should be the shift, and I
Right.
wonder sometimes if it actually is, if we are all really actively embracing that and owning that and understanding what that means, how to do it. Hopefully you will by the end of today.
And I think that also translates into how we tell our stories as libraries, because in the past, and this still happens, of people would say, oh, well, what does your library do? Or, do we need libraries now that you can find everything on Google? I think our knee-jerk reaction is to be like, well, we do a lot. We have books, we have programs, we have database, and just start like listing all of the things that we have, instead of pausing and maybe saying, that's a really interesting question. What do you think of when you think of the library? And then maybe even telling them a story about a person whose life was changed by the library. They're going to remember that if so much more than a list of all the services you offer, because also those services are going to change too. I mean, we're all, libraries are very dynamic, but the fact that we change people's lives or that we improve the community, that's not going to change. So if you can answer that question starting with the community or with the people, you're going to have a much better interaction with someone than listing all the services.
The laundry list of things.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
So the relationship that people have with their library and even more importantly, their librarian, I think in branding terms, it's that unique emotional space that we want in Anythink land. We want people to have that unique emotional connection with Anythink that they cannot live without us. That we're the organization that is the most important thing to them outside of their family or their work, that kind of thing.
So I think one of the things that struck me too, in addition to this idea of that perspective shift, right? Which I have a kind of a follow-up question. So we're already going to go off script, I think.
It's all good.
There we go.
But but in addition to that, there's an intentionality inherent in each of your statements, and that it's not, community engagement doesn't just happen with your library, and that there are some very, whether it's decisive actions, but this intentionality behind each of the statements that you have to do this, you have to reach out. You can't just wait for a come-see, come-all approach.
Absolutely.
So would you be able to speak a little bit to that? Because I think that's, I wouldn't say it sounds like a more assertive stance, but it definitely feels that way.
Absolutely, and it's that concept of taking the seat at the table, not waiting to be asked. Those days are over. We really do have to be more proactive, more engaged, more committed to our community, and to finding out what's going on out there. And that's going to take you getting out of your comfort zone, getting out of your physical space, going to those Chamber of Commerce meetings, going to those school board meetings, going to your legislator's office, and have them wonder, what are you doing here? Why is there a librarian here? That's your perfect opportunity to talk with people and let them know what's going on, but then to listen. We're great at talking at and telling people how to, but how much do we actually listen to the folks that we serve and find out what their needs are, and just take that time to reflect. But you have to be at the table. You have to be out there in the community in order to hear these and have these conversations.
So I'm going to take it a step further and say, I think that another role is actually setting the table. And that's something that we're working on in our library, and I know other libraries around the country as well, is that we are actively working to bring those community libraries, community leaders into the library, because they don't have an idea of what a 21st century library is actually about. Right. So we were working with Aspen Institute, and last week we're one of their guinea pigs for better arguments. And so we brought the community leaders. We had over 100 people. Economic development. We had the governor who launched it, and the conversation was happening in the library. And then people look around and they're shocked. Like, this is what a library looks like today. But I think setting the table is is as important as being at the table.
And you create those relationships, so to ask people to come to sit at that table is a lot easier when you've been out there, and then when you invite them, it's a natural, it's a connection. You've already connected with them.
Yeah, I was telling Mary Lou a story last night about how when I worked at Charlotte Mecklenburg twice. I left and came back, and during that time I was away, I worked in tourism. And so when I came back, I thought, there's a lot that we do in tourism that applies to libraries, because tourism is all about trying to get people to come to your community, to come to your destination. So it's destination marketing is what we would call it. And so trying to use that same perspective with the library, I brought in our local tourism authority and said, hey, our branches serve as tourist destinations, and how can we partner with you to kind of raise awareness? Because I wanted them as community stakeholders to really see the value of the library and how we could help them solve larger community problems and issues. And one of the things they mentioned were these networking events that they offered. And one of our staff said after the meeting, Cordelia, we're librarians. We don't do networking. And so I do think when we talk about shifting our mindset, I don't think we should be allowed to say that anymore. We do need to do networking. It's part of who we are and how we become embedded in the community, whether we're sitting at the table or setting the table. It's bringing those organizations in. It's going to where they are and looking at what problem are you trying to solve, and how can the library help you solve that? What can we do? What can we offer to help you reach your goals?
So having those relationships in place, I think, is core to our success. I was at a meeting a week ago, and the city or the county manager gave me a big hug, which is terrific. And we're a special taxing district, and actually the Adams County kind of kicked the library out because we were in such bad shape. But over the past 10 years, we've become a true asset for the county. And Ray Gonzalez said, Pam, we're bringing a contingent of people from Tokyo, about 35 to 40 people in July, and would like to bring them to the library. And I said, great. And then he said, would you be willing to host the opening luncheon? And I said, absolutely. So he's like, the first place that they want to bring visitors from Japan is the library.
That's awesome.
Incredible.
And you get to set the table?
Literally, we're working on the menu.
Literally and figuratively, yeah. So there's another aspect of this that I think kind of flows from that perspective shift, and it's also this idea of kind of relinquishing control. And control sounds like a kind of a hard term, but you are, by reflecting out and shifting that perspective, you're relinquishing control over what's going on in the library and kind of your own destiny, so to speak, as a system. Was there a point where you all were kind of doing that, and how did that feel? And how did that feel for staff, and what did you do in those moments?
Well, control is based in fear. You're afraid of giving up control, because then all hell could break loose, or chaos could happen, or somebody might destroy a book, or fall asleep in the library. It's addressing those fears that you have that are keeping you from making these real connections with your community.
Totally agree.
So I don't really see it as relinquishing control. If it is a shift from controlling, putting all those control mechanisms in place to protect the collection. But if your mindset is really, we're all about helping to support people and making sure they have a fabulous experience in the library, that's a very different way of thinking about it. So it's not like giving something up. It's just shifting your energy and your resources and thinking about it in a very different way.
And one great example of this, which is something that probably every library in this room does, is library cards, right? We were talking about this last night. So I'm listening to the audiobook of American Gods by Neil Gaiman. And in it, his main character goes to a library to get a library card and realizes he's going to have to wait a week. And I laughed so hard at that part because it's so true. Our library was the same. Many libraries are the same. So this idea that we are making people prove that they live in our community and therefore making it incredibly inconvenient for them to gain access to our library is an example of control.
Absolutely.
And how could we flip that process and flip that narrative to be, hey, we trust you. You're a part of this community. You have walked in our doors, or you have come to our website because you want to engage with us and we want to engage with you too. We're going to give you access right away. And maybe, there could be regulations or rules about this or that or the other, but I would challenge everyone to question those rules and regulations and really think bigger picture. What is it we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve something that is around proving people deserve to be in the library, or are we trying to achieve larger community engagement and really changing people's lives?
Absolutely. Or do we need to teach responsibility? I always love that. It's our job to teach responsibility. If we can relinquish that control and start to take down those barriers and start to build some more bridges instead of walls, then amazing things happen. I mean, it really is, you lighten the load from your community and your interaction with the community. There's less of that antagonism at the front desk. Your front desk staff gets a little bit of a relief because they don't have to be militaristic about your rules and regulations. And it requires that listening too. Like if people are complaining about the same things all the time, about having 2 pieces of ID and then having to mail the card to verify the address, even though you just saw the 2 pieces of ID, it establishes this lack of trust, as Cordelia mentioned. And then there's the argument that ensues, or the questioning, or the look on the kid's face that isn't going to be able to walk out with that library card. That sadness, and we're the cause of that. So it's such a great opportunity to make that shift and take those barriers away so that you can have a different relationship with the folks that you serve.
A couple of years ago, a consultant was talking with our board, and she said, it's easier to walk out of the airport with a rental card than it is to get a library card. And when you think about it, like a library card, and you might check out a book, which is $25, right, and a car, which is $25,000 or $35,000. We need to re-examine some of our policies and be a little more realistic, because the collection really belongs to the community and trust. And we've in our library, we had, just like in many libraries, I bet you've all had lots of conversations about those security gates. And we've had those as well. And from the very beginning, we just decided we wouldn't have security gates. And a lot of people thought, oh my gosh, that's the end of you. You'll never have any books on the shelves. Well, we've recently done inventory, and our loss rate is just a little under 3%, which is exactly what you would have with security gates. And so that trust factor is, we trust you, and we assume that you're going to respect and trust us back. And there's always going to be the folks that don't, like I call them the criminals. But I'm not going to make all my policies and all my rules for that 3%.
Exactly.
Right.
It's for the 97% or 98% of people, and then the atmosphere in the library changes.
Absolutely.
And I love your word of barriers, is that's really our job, is to minimize those barriers. So when people walk in the library, they feel like it's a place that they belong.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a great, very kind of concise example of what happens with the service mindset when you take a service mentality, and how even something as simple as the act of getting a library card completely changes, or could or should completely change depending on kind of where you are.
For a moment, if I may, I'd love to brag on my former library system, Charlotte Mecklenburg, because they did something really cool, which was, for years we had done library card drives with the local school district, and that would involve sending home flyers and library card applications, and maybe we get a 15% return rate on those applications and all this paperwork. And we just kept asking the question, how can we make this easier? How can we make this easier? And everyone's like, no, it can't be done, it can't be done. But long story short, they did figure out a way to do it. And what they did was they took kids' student ID numbers and made them automatically a library account. So every child in the local school district automatically had a library account. They didn't have to memorize a new number. They didn't have to get a new card. And with that account, they also didn't accrue overdue fines. So back to your barrier point. And so that, to me, was an amazing example of community engagement. And from there, they took it one level further, where they were getting the curricula from the administration of the school district and doing book lists around the curriculum of each class and on and on. I mean, to me, that is amazing. You know, it's not as flashy as we had a big concert or we did this big event and a lot of people came, but it's so much more impactful, and it really just touched all these kids who normally might have not been able to use the library at all. So I thought that was great. And then we also took it to the next level with communicating about it too, because it's not enough to do it.
Right.
You got to tell people that you did it, right?
Yeah. And it's changing that mindset from we can't to how can we? And it changes your perspective and shifts your thinking. And again, it's addressing the needs of the community. I mean, when I first started at Newburgh, we're a very large inner city library, and I noticed that there was hardly anyone at the internet computers. And I thought, my gosh, you know, this area is really depressed, and I know from statistics that 40 to 60% of the people in the area do not have access to the internet. So why aren't they here? And I started exploring the policies that we have. And first, we would not let our own patrons use the computers if they had $10 or more in fines. And then we would let people from the community just come in and use the library, use the computers, whether they had a card or not. And I thought, well, let's think about that for a minute. So who are we punishing here? We're punishing our own members. And we're telling them that if you have a fine of physical materials, you cannot use the digital world. And then we're letting everybody else come in. But then we would have them get a pass, and then they would come downstairs to get the pass to use the computers, and we'd say, no, you have to get the pass upstairs. So then they'd have to walk all the way back upstairs, and I'd say, okay, so what's wrong with this? Who are we serving here? Why don't we just give them the pass so it has the code so they can use the computer, and just let everybody be in that same place. Take that barrier of the fines away. Let them deal with the money they owe for lost materials at the circulation desk. But if when you're in a community that doesn't have access to the internet, and all the jobs now require that you use the computer to fill out your applications, well, where are they going to do that? They don't have a computer, and they can't use the library because they don't have the money to get past that barrier. So it's taking that moment to examine what you're doing and the frustrations that people are having, and take it as an opportunity to change.
So thank you all. So far, this has already been fantastic. And one thing I forgot to mention is that for anyone who registered, we are recording this session. And so if you registered, you'll get that link. So you don't have to be like me and writing furiously about some of the different ideas and quotes that are being thrown around. So we've launched this conversation with the notion that community engagement's evolving. So I'd like to ask kind of specifically, what is changing? How is it changing? And what's the catalyst for these changes?
Go for it, Pam.
When I think about, so I started my career at the Denver Public Library, which was another time and place for sure, in which community engagement at that time would be sensed as perhaps finding a partner that would fund a program that we had, that we wanted to accomplish, or help us accomplish a goal, whether it was funding or not. But it was very much library-centric. Like, this is our project, this is who we are, this is what we want to do. We could find somebody to help us do this. But we had already defined it. Mm-hmm. And I think that community engagement now is really, as you say, sitting at the table with potential partners actually making decisions and collaborating together about, this is my piece, like this is the library piece, I can bring this to the table, and the chamber says this is our piece, we can bring this to the table, and the school system says this is what we can do, or the justice system can say, like, this is what we can do, and it's more of collective impact. And so we're deciding together, and it's not about how can we make the library be great. It's about how can we make the community a more livable community, increase quality of life, and solve those problems, right?
And the community starts to see and experience the library as part of the resolution to those issues. You know, we're because we are there, we're listening, we're part of the conversation. And it's just so critical, because you won't hear any of that. You won't be able to participate in any of that if you're just staying in your space. And it's amazing what happens, the doors that open, the conversations that occur, and then the perception and the awareness of the library as not only a great physical space where everybody is welcome, but it's a great place for public forum. It's a great place to serve the needs of the community, and we start to be part of the solution because we're part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I think it's also about paying attention to how your community gets stuff done and how your community works. So whether that's paying attention, like in our city, we have a county commission and a city council. The county provides most of our funding, but I also would pay attention to the city council too, because even though they weren't funding us, they were still addressing community needs and challenges. So, you know, watching those meetings or reading the recap in the paper the next day to understand what was on the agenda for these different organizations. There's an old PR theory called agenda setting theory, where you really try to persuade people to make your organization part of the community agenda or the media's agenda. And for the library, when we went through a big budget crisis, we became a part of the agenda for a while. Like any coverage about the recession or funding issues always would mention the library. But eventually, once we got healthy and functioning again, we sort of dropped off. And so we had to work harder to figure out how can we stay part of the community's agenda. And to do that, we have to understand their agenda first, right? You know, what are their priorities? Do they have a strategic plan or strategic vision for the city, for the county, for the town that you're in? What is that? And then how can your library help get them there, help, you know, solve whatever challenges they've laid out or reach whatever goals they've established? The more you can position yourself in that way, and again, talk about it. Don't be humble. This is a problem in libraries. We're too humble. We got to stop being humble. We've got to talk about what we're doing, why it matters, why it's important. It's really valuable, again, for setting the table, for being at the table, and for being really engaged and part of the community.
You know, and from that marketing perspective, you know, when we went through the recession and we saw this rise in usage of our materials and our spaces, and people were you know, dropping their internet access because it was too expensive, and they're using the library. And I think we've really missed the boat on advertising that, on marketing that, and sharing those stories with the community, that when you're questioning the vitality and the relevancy of the public library, well, here's a perfect opportunity. But I think we were just humble. And we didn't jump on that and share those stories with people, and we really need to get more comfortable doing that.
And so I grew up in a family where you were not supposed to brag, right?
Too big for your britches. Don't be too big for your britches.
Exactly. So I think that translates into the personality of librarians in some ways. However, it's really not bragging. It's really sharing information that's critical. And one of the things that happened to Anythink 2 years ago when we did strategic planning, and we spent a year in the community listening to them. At the end, it culminated in a group of stakeholders helping us to prioritize some of the asks and wants of the community. And this is a direct quote from my community saying, we want Anythink to be a catalyst for innovation in Adams County. Now, I didn't invent that, and I would never have put that on my strategic plan, except that our leaders said that's what we want the library to be. So they were bragging on us, which is the best thing.
And that's where you really want it to start happening, because then other people start telling your story. You know, a few years ago, we began something at a previous library that I was at called Community Conversations, and many of you do that in many forms. But it was a great public forum to be the catalyst to start conversations about issues that were going on in the community. And it was great, you know, and sometimes they were contentious, and, you know, but we were giving people an opportunity to speak, to get things off their chest, and the library was seen as that safe public space to have that happen. And then what was so wonderful about that was several months, I guess it was after we started the first one, I was at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, and there was a contentious issue between the small business community and the town leadership. And somebody said, you know, we should really have a community conversation at the library about this. And I was like, yes.
Yes, we should. We should do
They
exactly that.
They took ownership over that, and that's when you know you've done something successful. It's great.
So what strikes me is in technology, we talk about the problem space and the solution space. And there are certain things you do in the problem space, and there are certain things you do in the solution space. And I think, you know, Pam, you mentioned, we have this program, and then you're reaching out to find people who may fund it or may be involved or help out. You've already defined the solution. You're already sitting in the solution space. And so if you're not reaching out in that problem space and then carrying it all the way through, it's not a fit, and it's not generating those outcomes. I think the other bit that is also happening is that these conversations are happening in your communities. I think it's important to know that your community is trying to figure out how to solve their problems. And the question is whether you're going to be there, hearing them, getting them to a point where they view you as part of that solution.
Right.
So if you're not spending that time and not making those outreach efforts in that problem space, so to speak, you will not be part of the solution
And
space.
we're not on their radar.
Yeah.
You know, and we need to be on everybody's radar.
So that really takes time and trust, and you have to be consistent. And it's not something that happens overnight. It's just like a good friend, right? It's a relationship that you develop over years and years and years and years, and people know that they can count on you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come easy, and it's not fast, I don't think.
Well, to that do you feel like community engagement is something that should be part of everyone's job at the library? People sometimes know, our programs people do that.
That's right.
Well, we need to talk about that a little bit. So is that something that should be everyone's job? And then taking that further, what are those skill sets for library staff to be successful? How can library leadership mentors support that growth for those staff members?
I think it is part of everybody's job, whether they acknowledge it or not. You know, it's like years ago, people would say, when I was in fundraising and development, would say, I hate fundraising development. I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. And I said, every time you open your mouth, you're either fundraising for your organization or you're not. You know, and so from your frontline staff to the people who are designated to do particular goals of situations like outreach or publicity or marketing, everybody is part of this. And so when you're training your staff, it's really got to be part of a comprehensive approach for everyone at every level, from the person who answers the phone, which is critical to me, the whole customer service aspect of it, to the people whose charge it is to actually go out into the community and talk with folks. It's really important that they are part of a whole team, that
Yeah.
mindset change.
I mean, every interaction is an engagement with your community,
Sure.
whether it's across a desk, whether it's your delivery truck drivers. I mean, we had fun, and we're lucky to have funding to actually wrap our delivery vans with like really fun, branded, colorful, like library messaging. And so as they were driving around the community, people see that van and they're like, oh, it's the library. And they would engage in conversation even with the drivers. So they were doing community engagement. So it doesn't matter what your role is, you're still representing the library the minute that people connect you with that organization. Even translating over into social media, which is a whole other topic, but how you're engaging on social media, both officially through your library social media presences, as well as your staff and how they are interacting in that space. we're all representing libraries in some level or another. So I think it is everybody's job. You can't ignore it, because otherwise you're missing that opportunity.
So I'm going to answer the second part of the question, Ty, which is what are we doing about it, or how are things shifting? If everyone is part of this community engagement, then that means the folks that we hire and the way we train them and evaluate ourselves basically is on characteristics that are soft skills, so to speak. And years ago, when we kind of reorganized, reinvented Anythink, we developed 13 basic competencies. And so we hire people who are collaborative, who like to work in teams, people who love people, people who take ownership in their work. One of our questions on all of our interviews is, what makes you happy? So we try to hire happy people. And I don't care I don't care what it is that makes you happy, but when we ask that question, I just look at their face. And I'm looking for kind of like that sheer happiness that just kind of lights up and makes the room feel welcoming and warm. And so hire happy people.
But I think that that's one of our challenges too, because a lot of people got into librarianship for a much different reason. It was a very sort of introverted, I'm going to be behind the scenes, or I'm just going to be handing out materials, I'm going to be doing reference, I'm going to be doing research. And now there has been a shift, and we are expected to do much more than that. And I think sometimes people don't take the time to say, maybe this isn't the field for me anymore. And I hate to say that, it's like telling people it's time to retire, but it's, I don't actually say that, I think it though. But it is a definite shift in how we interact with people and the expectations that the community has and that we have of ourselves and our industry. We do have to be more engaged. And it doesn't mean that because you're introverted or a quiet person that you can't engage. You just engage in a different way. But that you need to engage. We were laughing about this last night with a person that I know that wasn't at the chamber mixer that I went to, and I said, I wonder why she wasn't here. And then one of the board members for her library said, she told me she doesn't do mixers. and it's along those same lines as you mentioned before. And we don't have that privilege anymore or whatever, it's not the right word, but that excuse to not get engaged. In whatever way that you can connect with people, going to a mixer, going to a public function and talking about the library and talking about what you do and then listening to what the community has to say, it's just such a critical new way to engage with our community that is where we're at. I don't think that's ever going back to the old ways.
And I think maybe to overcome some of that like mental block that we either see in our colleagues or in ourselves, I think a very simple approach is just to ask yourself, what is the worst that could happen? Right. What is the worst that could happen if I went to that mixer? Maybe I'd feel overwhelmed and tired or whatever. That's like, but ultimately, but then ask yourself, what is the worst that could happen if I don't?
Right. The opportunity cost of inaction, yeah.
Exactly. What is the worst that could happen if my library doesn't get more involved in the community? If my library continues to throw up barriers and walls? If my library doesn't show its relevancy? That list of the worst that could happen is a lot longer and a lot scarier than what is the worst that could happen if I went to a chamber event. So if you are running across this in your libraries and you're struggling, I would encourage you to ask that question of, if you're struggling to get people to think more community engagement, to go through that exercise with them and ask them that question. It might get them thinking bigger picture.
Have any of you, either individually or in your library, kind of done a reflection activity like that? Just even show of hands, or has anybody really approached that from a specific way of like, I want to ask this question to see where we are? So, okay, so that's good. I think a few more might after this. Tons of questions. You are providing us any number of avenues to go down. I wanted to mention we will have some time at the end for a few questions too, and we'll let you submit those digitally. We've got some technology to help aggregate those questions really quickly so we can keep moving. I wanted to spring off of something Pam said, though, not to get all nuts and bolts on it, but you mentioned about kind of evaluating this effort. And that seems really tricky, and I think that stymies a lot of folks because it's not, hey, I'm going to go to my system and I'm going to spit out a circ number and I'm going to throw it on a report. So, what are you doing to define and track this community engagement activity? And then, again, going to the outcome, how do you use that information? And has the use of that information changed some of your stakeholder engagements, that sort of thing?
So I don't have the answer, but I do. We are on the trail of trying to find the answer, I think. And I think evaluation is something I wish I could afford to have someone on staff who could help us with this. One thing, and everybody knows that we're working towards, in public libraries, working toward outcome measures, which I think we're on a path, but I don't think we've arrived. I look at our basic statistics as kind of a dashboard. Like, we know how fast we're running, we know that we're still alive, but that's not telling us how well we're doing our work. So we are incorporating more qualitative, and you have to trust qualitative when you have those wonderful stories of people whose lives are actually changed. And I'm sure that we all have those amazing stories. We just made a shift, like just a couple weeks ago. A couple years ago, we stopped collecting the reference statistic, which is an anathema, and I'll probably be disbarred from the library community. For a number of reasons, and because I don't think we were collecting it accurately. Mm-hmm. But we just made a decision a couple weeks ago to start collecting all transactions that are happening. And at our front desk, a lot of our folks we call them concierges. So between our librarians, which we call them guides and concierges, we're going to start collecting all the transactions they have, because we're talking about experiences and relationships and connecting. All of those things that they do are important. So we're going to start tracking that. And also, we're working on trying to figure out how we will know that we're successful with our strategic plan. So some of our outcomes, and these are hard outcomes, people will feel happy, healthy, safe, and smart. How am I going to know that? So that is really a challenge to us, and we have had so many meetings with our team. We will figure that out, but it's going to take us a while. And I think it's okay to say, we're shifting over here, and how we know we're successful really comes down to some of those stories. And some of them I've told earlier today, is that when the county administrator comes to you, you know that the library is something important in their community.
It's critical.
I agree completely with you, and I used a very similar approach at Charlotte of a mix of sort of qualitative and quantitative. And using your dashboard example, things like circulation, program attendance, door count, whatever you measure, I think of those as leading indicators to let you know, like, oh,
Right.
good, people are coming in the door, they're using services, they're coming to programs. The lagging indicators are the more outcome-y type of measures, which are harder to measure. But again, you can go to your community organizations, like we were funded by the county, so we would go to the county and ask them, how are they measuring success? And then how could we piggyback onto that? So for example, they would do an annual survey of the community, and they would allow us to include questions in that survey. And it was a scientifically done survey, so we knew that the responses applied to the whole population of our county, which is about 1 million people. So we were able to track over time, and again, it took time, but we asked a question where people would respond to the statement, the library is a top institution in the community. And we were able to track that over time, and we saw in 3 years that increased by 10%.
Wow.
So that was a number. It's not the only measure, but it at least was a way to know that, hey, our message is getting out there, people are using us, people value us, demonstrative demonstrably more than they did 3 years ago. So there are opportunities that may be out there that are at low cost or even no cost if you could partner with another organization. It takes patience and time and being really intentional and thoughtful about the questions you ask and the sort of and what you do with that information when you get back, because that's the other piece with surveys. How many of us have done surveys and then like nobody looks at the data, right? I was always like the survey, like you have to look at the survey data. We are asking people for feedback. They're taking time to give it to us. You must look at it.
They're trusting us with information.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
You're asking them to take the
It's
time to
that
fill it out.
listening. So I won't get started on surveys, but anyway, that's a great example of a lagging indicator if you can find a way to measure it that can let you know how you're doing as part of the larger, like Pam said, qualitative measures as well. Or like your example where they said, we need a community forum at the library, you know, because you positioned yourself in that way.
And for anyone thinking, wow, that sounds like a lot of work, it sounds like it is a lot of work. And I think, you know, that focus, right, that means having a very clear focus among your staff and maybe not doing some things that you've always done. Either, you know, Pam, you said that was kind of inaccurate and it's not really getting at what we're trying to show as an outcome. There are things that will be, you know, kind of put on the shelf or left in the closet, so to speak, to be able to focus on that time and those metrics and those outcomes that you're really trying to push.
And I think we need to take real pride in our stories and our success
Yeah.
stories and the tales of our communities and to tell them, because statistics sometimes just sort of people glaze over. But if you can tell the stories behind those statistics, it really does set us apart from the other organizations in the community and the impact that we have. And again, to be proud of that, to be able to share some of those. And then you find your staff starts to tell you the stories that maybe they weren't saying before, they weren't expressing them before, because you've created an environment where you care about that. You care about hearing what your interactions are with the public. And I got a phone call the other day to come upstairs from one of my Cirque Desk staff, one of my concierges. And she said, I think you'd like to meet this fellow because he wants to donate $100 to us, but I think you need to hear his story. So of course I'm running up the stairs. And this was a fellow who had attended a job fair that we had had a few months before. And he'd been out of work for 6 months, and we had never had a job fair before. We had like 350 people show up for this job fair. And he ended up getting a job from that experience. Wow. And so he was standing there with his new, company logo shirt, and he was so proud. And I know he didn't have that $100 to give us. He had a $100 bill. And I said, oh, please, hang on to that. It's wonderful that you want to do that. He says, no, I really want to thank the library for providing this opportunity for me to get a job. And he handed me the $100 to give to our friends group. And I mean, everyone at the desk, the tears were flowing. And that story, that's that connection, it's just amazing. That's where our power lies.
So great. I have goosebumps. That story.
So I'm going to put up a slide for people to start submitting questions. So feel free to just go to slido.com, event 4244, and you can submit questions digitally. We'll be monitoring those. To spend a few minutes at the end. Knowing you, we have so much to discuss. I wanted to ask something that Cordelia mentioned earlier, kind of asking the question, what's the worst that can happen, right? Like what's the worst that can happen? And I wanted to ask, what is, in your opinion, the biggest mistake that you made along this continuum of community engagement?
There's that singer.
So it happened at some point.
We're librarians. We don't make mistakes.
Well, and to soften the blow, maybe, what learning experience came from that? How did you use that to inform your later efforts?
Well, I can go way back in time for mine, and it came to me right away, which, especially in my earlier years at Charlotte Mecklenburg, too much emphasis on events, right? Events as community engagement. And the more I work with libraries around the country, and I've been a jury member for John Cotton Dana, which means I've read hundreds, literally, of award applications of campaigns, and a lot of them are around events. and I'm not against events, and an event done really well can be a wonderful community engagement opportunity. But most of the time, events are just a one-time thing, and they don't create a longer-term relationship with libraries. And they take a lot of resources to put them on, to market them, to all of those components, to staff them. And when you think about the return on investment on your events, you really want to be pretty critical about that, because we had this great literary festival years ago called the Novello Festival of Reading, and we would bring in huge authors. It was well known. We had John Grisham one year, and we had, any Pulitzer winner of the 90s you can think of, we had them, just amazing. But the point was that it cost a lot to put on, because we wanted to have a low ticket price, so it wasn't a fundraiser. And people began to view it as very popular, but not essential. And so when we were on the chopping block for budget cuts, we got cut so badly because we were viewed as popular and not essential. So it's not that maybe Novello was a bad thing. People loved it. They cried when it went away. But what were we doing to really tell our story and to really engage with the community and solve community problems when you're bringing in, and we got in trouble in the paper for paying like $80,000 to John Grisham that year that he came, that we were disconnected with our community's needs and realities when we were doing things like that. And so now our foundation does an amazing event where they bring in New York Times bestsellers for no fee. And they fill a convention hall with 1,000 people, and then they bombard them with messaging and tearjerker stories like the one that Mary Lou just told for like hours while they're drinking wine. So that is community engagement. You've got people in the room all hearing amazing messaging about the library and being able to interact with the library and all these things. That type of event can be great, but the types of events that I often see in libraries, even to this day, and the kind that we used to do early in my career, were not really community engagement.
Interesting.
Well, the movie producer George Lucas said that if you're going to put your ass on the line, you better be prepared to have it kicked as well as kissed. And so I've had my ass kicked a lot, but I still do it. I try a lot of different things, and some things are successful and some things fall flat. The ones that fall flat are when I was not listening or paying attention to what is really going on out in the community. But I tried, and I will do something different. I will, take that failure and turn it into something that I really have learned from. It's just being brave enough to try new things and realizing that some things may work and some things don't. But again, so what? You tried, and you put yourself out there. So be brave.
So one of the things that Anythink is known for is goats. My staff are going, oh no, don't go there. A couple years ago, our facilities manager, Doug, came to me and said, I think we should hire urban goats to mow our grass, right? And my first...
You can hire a goat to mow?
You can hire herds of goats. And so, of course,
Pam knows a guy, if you're interested.
Give me his card, would you know?
My first thought was, what could possibly go wrong? But it turned out to be, and this is a strange thing to position as community engagement, but it turned into community engagement because one day 300 goats showed up at our library, and it turned into the biggest experience and reference experience ever. So they were there for a week, and people asked all sorts of questions, et cetera, and it was fabulous. And they fed the goats, and they went home, and they pulled weeds from their garden, and they brought them to feed the goats. So it was such a success. I mean, just the entire community came because they loved to pet the goats and be there and ask questions. So the next year, we hired a different goat herder, and we had an accident. Nobody was hurt, but a dog got out from the backyard adjacent to the library. So the dog started chasing the goats, and that did not go well. So you just have to evolve. You have to evolve, and so now we don't have goat herds. We just work with a small farmer in rural Colorado, just east of the airport, and they bring maybe a dozen goats, and they do it for all of our branches, and it's like a petting zoo. So we took a community engagement and we downsized it.
So we've got some great questions coming in. I would like to ask one of these for sure. Well, actually, there are several great ones, but where was that? Any thoughts on reaching different cultural groups, and what's the same or different from broader community engagement? And I think that's something we're seeing a lot, and a lot of people have questions about how do we reach some of these different community and cultural groups.
I actually, so as a consultant, one of my local clients is a free pre-K program, and we're trying to reach our immigrant populations in Charlotte. So I met with one of the experts in our city government who works with those populations just like 2 days ago. So this is fresh in my mind. But one of the things that he told me, he said, in Charlotte we do, the way that we try to do community engagement is a lot of events, again, and talking at people but not listening. So I think it is, again, we've said it a million times, it's about listening, but it's also about going to where they are and not trying to force the round peg into the square hole and make them come to where you are. And so it's still certainly a nut we're trying to crack, both with the pre-K program and with our local library, but more and more we're learning to go where they are.
Yeah, that's great.
Involve them in the conversation,
Yeah.
ask them.
Exactly.
I mean, how do we know, Yeah.
So I think listening is really one of the most critical pieces. In our community, we have about 30 to 40% Latino. And one of the things that's really important is to listen, because what they've told us is if you get the kids in the library, then the families will follow, because the library is a little scary. And you can't make preconceived assumptions. For instance, about language, materials, etc. You have to listen to what they're asking for, and not just go out and buy a bunch of Spanish language materials that might not be the right thing. You have to understand what is it specifically that's going to be that's going to meet your needs.
Yeah. And I'll say too, from previously I've done some community outreach engagement in the Columbus area with their Somali population. And in addition to being an incredible experience, often it involves food, which is another nice plus as well. But again, you have to go where those groups are, and you have to ask them, and they may be surprised to see you, and that's okay. That's going to be a good thing.
And
Bring food.
You have to have staff who speak the language too. Like
Yeah.
one,
Right.
one issue we would have in marketing is people would say, "Can you translate this marketing material into Spanish?" And we would say, "Yes. What phone number should we put on here for people to call for more information?" And they'd be like, "Oh, we don't have a phone number they can call where we know that person will speak the language."
Yeah.
So if you're promising something in your marketing, you've got to deliver on it. You've got to close that loop and do it in a way that is matching the promise. If you're promising that you're welcoming to people who don't speak English, you need to have the staff person who can communicate with them. Otherwise, you've missed that opportunity.
So one kind of very, very quick but meaty question to kind of close things out today, and thank you again for an incredible discussion. For any libraries who want to increase the level of engagement with their communities, what's the one piece of advice you'd give them, kind of walking out the door, to carry with them through ALA and back into their lives and work?
Take risks.
Be brave. Step outside of the library. Amazing things will happen when you form new relationships and connections with your community.
But what they both said, and just keep the conversation going with your community. Just always be listening, always be talking and engaging with people. Even if you're at the grocery store and you're not at work, it's always, just keep that mindset all the time and encourage your colleagues to do the same.
Thank you. Well, thank you again so much. I've learned a ton. Let's give it up for our panelists.